Thank you. Welcome to this meeting of the Herefordshire Council Audit and Governance Committee being held on Monday, 27th September 2021. For those present in the meeting room, fire alarm sounds, please leave the building by the nearest exit and make your way to the fire assembly points in the car park. The agendas, papers and other relevant information for this meeting are available for public viewing on the Herefordshire Council website. The Council is streaming this meeting live on the Herefordshire Council YouTube channel and is making a recording. To ensure that recording quality is maintained, please speak as clearly as possible and keep background noise to a minimum. Please ensure that mobile phones and other devices are turned to silent. Others are permitted to film, photograph and record public meetings, providing it does not disrupt the business of the meeting. If there are any members of the public present who do not wish to be filmed or photographed, please raise your hand now so that any person filming or photographing may be made aware. Only committee members present in the meeting room may vote. We have a number of people in attendance as virtual participants. Can I request they use the raise hand function within the system if they wish to contribute? And I'll ask my clerk to try and draw my attention to them if they raise their hand and I can't see them. So we begin with item 1 on the agenda, apologies for absence. And can I ask the clerk to report apologies if I received?
We've had apologies received from Councillor Audit, Bolter and Matthews.
Thank you. Do we have name substitutes?
We have one name substitute for Councillor Bob Matthews, and that's Councillor Sebastian Bowen. No other name substitute.
Thank you. Item 3, declaration of interest. Do any members wish to declare any Schedule 1, Schedule 2 or other interests in any agenda item? Thank you. Item 4, minutes. Minutes of the meeting held on the 30th July 2021 are included in the agenda at pages 11 to 20 for approval. No matters of accuracy have been notified to the monitoring officer. Are you content that I sign the minutes as an accurate record?
Yes.
Getting nods.
Abstain.
Thank you. I'll sign those later. Normally, at the end of the minutes, we have an action log. I noted that it was missing from this.
Yes, apologies, Chair. An action log will be prepared and updated with readiness for the next meeting on October
27th. Agenda item 5, questions from members of the public.
Chair.
Sorry.
Given that we haven't got the log, but there's a lot of items in here that are saying that actions to be taken, how are we dealing? Are we dealing with that now? There's items in the minutes that say resolve that various things will happen, or how are we dealing with those?
We'll ask that those items be reported on the October log. I think so that we can collect them and have actions reported against actions outstanding.
That's fine, thank you. I mean, there are quite a few here that do require attention or said to be happening, and I think we did need to specifically, if we're going to miss them today, then there's going to be 2 lots of actions.
Right. There will be 2 lots of actions to be taken forward.
Fine, thank you.
At the moment, we only have the minutes and the actions outstanding, so I suspect we don't have the officers' reports on what actions have been taken.
Right. Thank you.
So, agenda item 5, questions from members of the public. No questions have been received from members of the public on this occasion. Agenda item 6, questions from councillors. No questions have been received from councillors. So I now turn to agenda item 7, the energy waste loan update. The purpose of this is to update the Audit and Governance Committee on the current status of the energy and waste arrangement to enable the committee to fulfil its delegated functions. Just for committee to note, this is a singular item which the Audit and Governance Committee has responsibility for having been delegated from full council. The loan was originally taken out. Presenting officer in this instance, I think, will be JC Rushgrove, Head of Corporate Finance, and I presume she'll be.
I'm happy to take it.
Okay, Andrew will present the paper as our 151 officer.
Thank you, Chair. The paper, as you see before you, is advising the committee of the status of the current loan arrangements. I'm pleased to have a report that everything is behaving as it should do. There are no concerns flagged to you as a committee, and that they're making repayments when they fall due, and there's no concern about their financial viability. I'm conscious that there are other conversations going on within the council about what happens when our current waste contracts come to an end, and those are ongoing, and General Scrutiny are looking at those quite closely.
Thank you. Do I have questions from the committee on this?
Thank you for the opening comments. We're in partnership with Worcestershire Council, and with also, I know the shareholders in this are Worcestershire Mercia Waste Management Limited. When we're in these partnerships and we're looking at our risk registers, presumably we have to assess the viability of both those other bodies with regard to any risk to this council. And I looked at the company accounts for Mercia Waste Management. They seem to be extraordinarily profitable out of the two councils. Basically, they're only doing the work for that company deals with those two. They seem to be financially somewhat sound simply because of the sheer amount of money that's being paid to them by both of the councils. So I suspect that, and I hope that the consideration in the future might look rather hard at how that is set up, because it seemed to me that somebody along the way had allowed somebody to make a considerable sum out of the process. And I appreciate there are difficulties with regard to managing waste, and let's basically want to do better at it. But it is a bit of a shock when you look at what the company's accounts look like. I don't think there's any risk in that company going bust, let's put it that way at the moment.
Chair, I wouldn't disagree. And so from the purpose of this paper, then I have to report that our partner ranks 18%, it's financially robust. As I said, there are other conversations going on with the council about how to renegotiate the arrangements after the current contract comes to an end. Those are factors that are being actively considered by our colleagues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Bowles.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just had a question. Andrew, if you could remind me, I was just looking at the figures, and I can see that total repaid to date 16 million with a total loan value of 40 million with only 2 years to go. So if I look at a domestic arrangement, if you repaying interest and principal, it normally goes down to zero at the end of the year, but there's quite a gap. So could you just remind me what the arrangements are? Is there a lump sum that is due to be paid at the end, or how are those figures reconcile?
Yes, happy to do that. The arrangement is that when the current contract comes to an end, there will be a balance outstanding on the loan. The value of the plant is in far excess of that value, so there's still considerable equity in the arrangement. These are some of the options being considered. So one option is to agree an extension of the contract and agree to refinance. Another option is to sell the plant. Another option is to, in fact, the councils take over the whole arrangement themselves. So there are a number of options that are being considered as part of that process of what happens at the end of the current contractual arrangement.
And from an audit committee perspective, what involvement will we have or be required to have in those discussions in terms of our responsibilities over the summer?
As the audit and governance committee, your role is to oversee the council acting as the bank. So if one of the proposals being considered is to refinance or to enter into another loan arrangements, then your role will be overseeing that part of that arrangement. All the operational matters and the choices about how the operating model are handled by other committees of the council. This is where the distinction is that this committee is to look at the council acting as a bank.
Thanks,
Thank you, Andrew. Just to be clear then, the £40 million loan was never envisaged to be paid over the current period of the waste contract. That's what I'm saying.
That's correct, recognising that the value of the plant far exceeds the loan outstanding.
Thank you. I have two recommendations in front of me. Recommendation A and B. A, that the risks the council has lender are confirmed has been reasonable and appropriate in regard to the risks typically assumed by long-term senior funders to waste projects in the United Kingdom as a practice. And B, that arrangements for the administration of the loan are reviewed and confirmed as satisfactory. Are there any other recommendations from the committee? Any other comments?
Just going to pick up on that second one. Arrangements for the administration loan are reviewed and confirmed as satisfactory. That is, as it stands, is what's being said, isn't it? And any review will be for the next, or what happens at the end of that loan time. So I'm just conscious that from what we've just been saying, that there's going to be a complete revaluation that's going to occur. There's likelihood that the value of the loan or that it's set against is probably going to exceed the value. It does exceed the value of the loan. What are we actually confirming in that D?
I think my understanding is that confirming that the Waste Credit Committee risk register, which is the risk register, that the loan principal and all payments of the loan required values detailed in the contract to parties, and that risk reference A, the default of loan payments by the borrower to lenders is acceptable. And both are, well, one's reported as very low and one's reported, and I don't never like reading the words almost impossible because they always make me start quite low and then goes to item reported, I think page 27.
Wow. Yeah.
Information. I'll defer to the one-by-one officer. I think that's what that recommendation is.
It is, Chair, but you may want to, as a committee, ask further information about that whilst we're in this current phase. That's why it's recommendation is weighted the way it is.
My sentiment is that we want to be very clear. I mean, there's change in the nature of the ownership in there. It implies that this is now owned by a Chinese company, or appears to be. Says that the obtainment of official loans no action required by any parties arranging from this change of ownership, and so there are no changes to the shareholder. I think that we want to be clear that that sounds to me as though it's still a dynamic process, and therefore we want to make sure that that continues to be the reassurance is given, because otherwise, with the amount of changes that are occurring, I want to feel comfortable that that level is constantly reviewed and made clear that there is risk. We appear to have a share of a considerable asset, but I'm not sure how saleable that asset might be. And I would like to be comfortable to know that that is fully covered.
Thank you. So I think the recommendation would be that the 151 officer writes to the and refers to the dynamic nature of the ownership changing, and requests that this audit committee is kept up to date with changes to the risk register kept by Mr. Chair relating to the matter. Is that
Thank you. I think that does. I mean, I'd put down 3 particular points that struck me. One was manpower staffing, given the issues that relate at the moment to the inability to find people to drive lorries, and the whole system relies on lorries. So I think there is a risk in there. There's a risk in inflation, because that looks as though it's now on the cards as a serious entity. But in fact, there's been an increase in the value of the waste product, and in fairness, they should be doing even better than originally thought. Obviously, there's a risk of interest rates coming up. So I think that is something where, because of the size and scale of investment, it's wise that we get keep a constant monitor on what is happening there, because it has very serious implications for what we do with our waste in the future.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think as far as being able to sell this asset, I think it might be a very desirable asset for some companies to try and purchase. I didn't think it's a dead duck, as you might say. So I think one's money is probably pretty safe there. But I would hope that we will keep it, because I think it's a very valuable asset for us, especially as the demand on, well, the absolute demand to reduce landfill to nothing is going to be there with us for the rest of the time. So let's be very cautious before we try to say something meaningful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know whether, John, you've managed to put together note, recommendation, third recommendation now on the screen. Would you want to read that out?
Yeah, I will do, Chair, yes. So the 2 recommendations, 1 and 2, are taken directly from the report, and recommendation 3 is that the section 151 officer writes to the Worcestershire Committee, referring to the dynamic nature of the ownership chain, and requests that this AG is kept up to date with any changes to the risk register kept by Worcestershire in relation to this matter.
Is that acceptable?
I think that's a good way forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so can we put those 3 recommendations to the vote? Say aye or wave your hands. That is passed. I now come to item 8 on the agenda, the corporate risk register. Our purpose here is to consider the status of the council's corporate risk register in order to monitor the effectiveness of risk management within the performance framework. And we have our SDS corporate performance here to talk us through any points you want to bring forward from risk registers.
Thank you, Chair. This is the Council's corporate risk register as at the end of July. July risk register is provided.
Could you just bring your microphone a little bit?
Sorry. The July risk register is one that's been provided. It's allowed risk owners to provide the necessary updates at the end of the month. Time for scrutiny and challenge of those risks through DLT processes and circulation through our standard governance processes prior to this meeting. As per the cover report, there's been some movement in the corporate risk register since the last report to committee. There are currently 3 risks escalated on the corporate risk register. We have a new risk in relation to the stability and sustainability of care homes within the county, a risk in relation to the value for money provided by the sufficiency strategy. The sufficiency strategy sets out the demand for placements for children in the council's care and the ways in which they'll be met, and a risk in relation to high risk and notable children's cases within the courts. And that one's been reworded since the last iteration presented to committee. There have been a number of risks which have either de-escalated or closed during the period. There's an overarching risk in relation to COVID-19, which has been de-escalated in line with Silver Command reporting. The risk in relation to school assets is now reduced due to an improved management arrangement, which has reduced the likelihood of the risk occurring. The impact of COVID-19 on population health management has also been reduced following the sign-off and the start of the implementation of the COVID recovery plan and a robust plan for vaccination. The children's budget and savings risk, as it was previously written, has now been closed. However, that risk is now inherent within the new risk in relation to the sufficiency strategy. We sat with the new management team a couple of months ago, and they were very clear that they wanted to focus their risk register around the children within their care. So they wanted less of the onus on the finance, but of course the sufficiency strategy talks of value for money. They're clear that obviously if children need to be in care, they need to be in care. So human rights claims has effectively been merged with the above risk, and foster carers is also linked to the sufficiency strategy. Obviously, as I said, much of the change is a result of the new children's management team reviewing the risks held within their previous version of the register. As I said, they were very keen to make sure that focused from a child's perspective of risk. The committee also has requested previously that the changes are more evident within the corporate risk register, and hopefully Appendix A has helped to make that a bit easier for you all to note where the changes have been made. I think then just a chance to reflect. Conscious we're probably now a year into the new risk framework, just coming up now, so perhaps it's a good opportunity just to focus on the things that we've managed to achieve in those sort of 10, 12 months, and the things that continue to go well. Framework itself obviously needed to be implemented, so obviously we communicated and worked with a large number of officers to make sure that the changes were implemented. Changing risk scores from the previous versions of risk frameworks to the new ones. So all of that took quite a bit of work with officers. And I think we're starting to see the changes within our risk. We're not seeing so many long-standing risks appearing on the register month after month, quarter after quarter. And hopefully we view that as progress. We've held training with the council's leadership group using an expert from Zurich through the council's insurers. Gave a good overview for sort of leadership officers in terms of the benefits of managing risk, because I think that's an important sell to officers, and also the overview of our framework. So, having an external voice coming in and looking at it is a real positive. I think from my knowledge, this is the first session of risk training with the council, probably 5 years plus, maybe longer. So I think there's a real positive there. We hosted 3 sessions, and across them we got nearly 60 people in the virtual room. So that goes quite a long way across our leadership group. And I think an hour or an hour and a half out of their diaries to sit down and consciously think about risk is is a real positive thing. Whilst we had the risk expert in as well, I managed to get him to have a quick look over our risk framework and kind of kick the tires of that from his perspective. And I think, I was quite reassured that, he was clear that all the right things are on the page, and, we're not got blinding gaps in our risk framework. We can tie it a little bit more to national standard framework. So we've got the right things on the page, but I'm not going to say it's more by luck than judgment, but we had the right things on the page. But he suggested that, you can tie this into a national framework here or a recognised model here, so we can incorporate them and tie ourselves back to standards a lot more. We've identified a number of additional checks and balances through the course of the year, and that's allowed us to make sure and challenge service areas to get the right risks on the page for their service areas. And through my team, we continue to provide challenge to service areas, and I know we've still got a number of queries which are out with various service areas, which we want responses to in order to make sure that they're as robust as they can be. We now have a new desire to revisit risk through management board more regularly, and we're pulling together a new, ultimately a product which allows us to see our risk much more readily, tie it and align it to the performance and our delivery of projects and programs as well. So that will be allow for better triangulation. We've identified some risk leads in each of the directorates, so assistant director or director level risk leads in each directorate. That's helped us have a kind of a bit of a steering group around risk internally across senior officers, which is given us a bit of an inter-directorate leadership teams through those individuals. So coordinating them has been really good. We've recently appointed a risk and assurance manager. So that person will sit alongside the insurance function as well. So it will give us greater resource and capacity in this part of the system, greater focus on risk. And again, triangulation with insurance as well. So if we're seeing spikes through insurance activity in certain parts of the council, then we can triangulate that back to our risk framework as well. And we're just starting to look at commissioning a new risk system for the council. We're very conscious that a system isn't the fix in its own right. We need to work better to kind of get the risk more embedded within the council, but a system will reduce the production time for paperwork and risks, and I'm really keen that it will drive greater onus back onto the risk owners to regularly review risks and make sure that they're as accurate as they can be. But of course, as we recognise in the paper, we're reviewing the framework. We're providing our annual review now, working through that with the solicitor for the council as the risk lead. And that will be completed in autumn time. So there's some obvious gaps that we want to kind of make sure that we fill within that. I think we've talked to the committee briefly about that before, but strategic risk or horizon scanning of risk is a big one. Our current framework focuses more so on operational risk because of the importance of high scores means increased likelihood has to come into effect. So strategic or horizon scanning will allow sort of slightly longer range. Again, we've talked before here about horizontal and vertical integration of risks, so the same risk appearing across the council a number of times. We know the corporate centre team meeting is an important part of that process, but also that strategic horizon scanning risk register will also help us pick up on that quite a bit. And I want to be really comfortable that we're integrating project risk into our framework as well. And the challenge around that is the different materiality across different projects. So, one project might be quite small, but a risk is quite significant to that project. In the grand schemes of things, it's probably not that big, but we've got big projects which will have a big impact on the council, whether it's our financial risks, our reputational risks. But it's important we get that integrated. We've drafted the process, but again, it's pushing on embedding that and implementing it to its fullest effect. So they're the key bits that we're looking at tying up now through the next couple of months as we finalise that framework. I think that's it. Is there any questions?
Thank you, Paul. A more general question, first of all, and I do have a few comments that Councillor Bartlett made that I'll pick up. In your own view, where are the weaknesses still in the implementation of the system? Conscious we've seen changes in the senior management team. Obviously, they all come in from other authorities and places. Then I'm familiar with the way we worked and the way we're currently trying to work. I just wondered if you wanted to comment at all on how you think the senior management team are tackling their approach to risk.
I think the first thing is when you look at our risk framework, it's not significantly different to other local authorities. We have a lot of the same risks on the page as other local authorities. So, and I think particularly when we talk about having fairly standard processes and as we bring in those good bits of practice, we will sit very similar in terms of risk framework to most authorities. So that inherently brings about some familiarity for those officers when we come in. You know, ultimately our risk framework is like everybody else's. We identify risk, we score it, and we handle it then based on that scoring afterwards. So the changing of staff obviously just means obviously we need to go back and refresh with those sort of key areas of staff. We've done the session with children's, had a good conversation with their DLT. I think perhaps again in the next quarter we'll sit down and have another one and reflect upon what they produce as their updated risk register. But yeah, those challenges keep coming from our team, and we keep pushing that back to service areas to make sure that they think in the right ways that we want to, and make sure that we identify the mitigations we need to. So, and obviously if we're keen to review risk and those strategic risks through management board as we are, I think that gets everybody on the same page as well. So that would be an important step in the process. I should say actually we've got a workshop booked in for next week with management board. So it's very imminent in terms of our conversation with them about those bigger strategic risks for the council. So.
Thank you for that. It sort of aligns with, I mean, my concern is not the risk register provides us as a committee with the assurance to give us on that assurance to the council that risks are properly identified and mitigated against where possible. I'm also anxious that the risk register really provides a tool for senior management to allocate the source. That's where it's needed to mitigate that risk. Turning to Councillor Bartlett's comments she made, page 37, CRR 59. That specifically, she writes this is specifically again cease trading because it's now need updating now the residents move off the risk register next time. I think we pass that back to the risk holder. Obviously, this risk register data end of July. So that specific closure has happened now. However, I suspect there may be others that the risk holder is knowledge of, and whether it's a high corporate risk or not, to him or her to make a decision about.
Yes, of course, we'll take that back with the Director of Adults Care. As you say, it's the risk as at the end of July when that was, a very live issue. But I think I would be surprised to see it disappear too far. I think, the stability of the care sector at the moment with workforce and other post-COVID issues.
So rapidly in this. Councillor Jim.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to come back on that because it seems to me there's quite a few things in here where we've got partnerships or arrangements with other bodies. And the weak link very often may be them. And I thought this was a very good example of where we've had to very rapidly, and I must say, I take my hats off to all of you involved in this because it's been an amazing piece of work they've had to do so quickly to rescue and to assist and to help the very people who are the most vulnerable in this instance. But yet again, it is the council acting as some safety net. And one does wonder, in terms of other organisations, whether resilience planning, if one might put it that way, should be part of any dialogue with those with whom we are regularly in contact. Because we've now got the last week or two, we've got goodness knows problems of people with lorries and we can't get enough people to drive them, or buses, for example. I mean, one of the major complaints I'm sure many of us are getting at the moment about buses. Well, they're independent, they're nothing to do with the council because that's how the system works. But fact remains that people can't get buses, can't get the drivers to run for the buses anyway. So again, the council sort of becomes last resort, and there's a sort of overarching risk here that seems to me that when all else fails, everybody turns to the council to bail them out. And it's, I think we do need to have our antennae looking at very much what societal challenges there are, because we may well be asked, how do we deal with this? You know, it's not a council-run issue, but it's a council-picked-up issue, and this was a good example of that. And further on, there's a whole series of companies with whom we're, or bodies we're in partnership with, and I was just getting a little nervous reading through some of those and thinking, well, do I understand those companies? Do I know that we are looking at them with the same forensic risk eye that we should have? And I think then comes from that, because it's one thing to recognise the risk, it's another thing to manage the risk. And I think we need reassurance that sometimes these risks were identified can be managed in the way in which the report says they're going to be. So I'm very pleased you're having your meeting with senior management team, because I think I would hope that we can send a very sort of strong message here that we're very pleased to see the recognition. Can we be reassured that those risks are capable of being managed, or that if they're not, that we get a very rapid understanding of where the difficulties are and pass the management team to cabinet, to council or whatever, or through ourselves?
I think perhaps if I might, to add on to that, particularly your first point about providers, you know, we talked about the 4 T's in risk and managing our risk, and obviously in this instance we're trying to transfer the risk onto another party. Of course, where we've got our statutory function to provide some of these services, that then leaves us with that ongoing challenge, doesn't it? So I think there's certainly something there I can take away and see where I can land it, but that contract management sort of process around how confident are we on their identification of risk and their resilience plans, and I think there's definitely a question to be asked there. Yeah.
If I may just come back very briefly, you made the point that it's a statutory responsibility. I think I'm taking it slightly broader, where this becomes a societal view that the council should be responsible, even if it doesn't have the statutory position. And I think that's very broad and very difficult, but it does need the council to spell out where that is or isn't, and to be assured that others are taking that risk themselves in understanding the resilience of their business and how it works.
Thank you, Councillor Jim. Councillor Byrne wants to come in. Just to add to the points you made, a reflection in terms of the current situation in regards to fuel supply. I'm not sure how the council itself has a contingency plan for fueling its fleet, or the fleet, or fleets of those agencies and third parties which deliver council services. The situation will resolve itself in the near future, but it's a thought that we perhaps don't see anything in the scripts about how we keep our delivery personnel on the road in time when we have some electric vehicles, but much of our work is delivered throughout the county in terms of home visits, in terms of outreach work. And I can appreciate after listening to some of the subtales on the radio this morning of critical workers. I think it's back to identifying risks, and the risks are quite often not the ones you thought were going to be the ones that some broad approach, and I just raised that initially. Councillor Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wonder, do we have the ability to look at our partners' risk registers at all? Do they cooperate like that, or is that something entirely private to them? So if we had some access to that, you know, if we were on the same sheet, as you might say.
That's an interesting. It's not something I'm familiar that we currently have any authority to ask for. I think we would. I have an inclination to suggest that obviously the contract management of the relationships that we have with our delivery partners would be looking at the risk registers, but I don't believe we've ever issued any guidance on that. I don't know, Claire, whether you've got any corporate memory of any background on that.
No, you're exactly right, Chair. So under contracts where we have contractual arrangements, there will be provision of information clauses where we could request if there was a need, but we have to always show them the need why we need to see a document. And then in relation to partnerships, again, we don't have an automatic right, but if as a result of our own audits we thought it was appropriate to do so, then we would ask for them.
And actually, do we ever ask for them? And would it not be sometimes extremely useful if we did?
I haven't personally asked for any. I would need to ask the people who manage those contracts and those partnerships whether they have or not.
I think that'd be an interesting question to deliver perhaps to contract management, whether or not they've ever requested those risk reports. It does precipitate perhaps the question whether all the bodies have risk report. Because it's often reflective of a more corporate world, but nevertheless we have relationships with smaller bodies. We're encouraged to have relationships and contracts with yet smaller bodies going forward, so that the funding is delivered more locally. But there is always an inherent risk there that the risk governance framework isn't enjoyed by small companies. I've got lots of hands going up.
Well, I just wondered if there could be a recommendation of some sort in there.
Can I leave you to think about how we frame that recommendation? I'll take some other contributions and come back to you.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, Councillor Bowen is following the same line of thought that I think I was in terms of the direction of these partnerships. And I mean, when you go further down the pages of this, for example, I'll give you the Herefordshire Community Safety Partnership. No legal agreement, no update in terms of reference when were they reviewed, no formal accounts, no audit, no inspection, no review of value for money. Now that comes out of here. Now, if I read that in externally of a company, I'd be putting it on the risk register as a risk. And that's one of our own partnerships. Now, I don't know enough about that to know what the risk is in that, because I don't know the internal workings of it. But when I see the format laid out there for me to read today, and it's got all of those with a no in front. Basically, I reviewed anything that got a no in front of it, and went, if it's got a no, should it have it? And if it hasn't got it, is it then fair enough? It shouldn't say no, it should say not necessary or not required or something. But the moment it says no, the antennae go up going, hang on, why haven't you got a legal agreement? Why haven't you got published accounts? Why haven't you got audit and inspection? Because it seems to me that it sets us all up with a real question mark of what's happened. Now, maybe that's the format in which these were written out, and I'm interested in your comment. But there were quite a lot of those that were our partnerships or part of the council or engaged with, which had got those sorts of answers.
Indeed, yes. That's a lot.
Great. I was just reflecting on Councillor Bowen's point, because that's what we have just done with the waste loan update, isn't it? In point 3, we've actually asked to be updated on their risk register. So I think that's a very good point, and Councillor Jimmins stolen my thunder because I was going to raise those points in point 9 in the next agenda item. But Chair, after you've made Councillor Bartlett's points, I've got a number of points I'd like to raise around the corporate register, around the risk register, please.
Well, certainly, we'll come back to you. There are two more points that Councillor Bartlett raised, I think, which are both typo errors. Page 38, CRR 39, the risk score after controls should be 15, not 55. On that one. That's 5. The same page, CRR 50, this descriptor says the risk remains red, risk score after controls shown as amber. This is correct. So this is in terms of school assets. Still at 50 after mitigation. And the question is, should that still be in red at 50? Not in amber.
It's amber.
It's amber.
He says with a reasonable degree of confidence. 16 and above is our corporate risk. So
Right. In that
15
case,
remains.
there's just 9 at 15 should turn to amber then.
39 is yes. That one was one we changed quite last minute, following the conversation with Silver Group through Claire. So that one is an oversight on my part. So
That's all right.
the 55 making it red is correct, but if it's 15, yeah, that would definitely come down to an amber. So yeah, that's a mistake on my part. Sorry.
That's fine. That deals with the comments that Councillor Bartlett raised. I don't know if we have a recommendation formed yet.
Well, the recommendation is that we explore the possibility of being able to see and review our partner companies, organisations' risk registers. Something like that. John, you might want to find it.
I have made a probably quite a clumsy attempt to try to draft a recommendation. I'll put it up on screen and see what I think I've heard 2 recommendations in the course of the discussion. The committee seeks reassurance that identified risks with third parties and where the council takes on responsibility for those risks, that they are being managed effectively. And then Councillor Bone, I think the risk that you were identifying is that partnerships engaged with the council are routinely being requested to provide access to their risks, their identified risks, and management of those risks.
I think that's interesting.
Could I just ask Claire, sorry, that we're not exceeding our
Are we going too far?
should we be asking management to ensure that this work is done? And they then give us the assurance? Or are we asking, as it seems here, for those risks to be brought to us? Councillor Watson.
Thanks, Chair. My point would be about proportionality. You know, it's about the proportionate of the risk that we have within the partnership. I think it's about what we've just done with the waste loan update, is that it's one that we're concerned about, that we want to cite as an audit and governance. But I think that it's within the contract and within management, I would say, but it's really about the proportionality of the risk that we take within the partnership or in that contract. And I think that if we have got a significant interest, or no, I should say, the other party, the third party, has more than 60% of, you know, of the risk that has an impact on us, whether reputational or whatever, or financial, then I think, but it's that proportionality, how do we determine? And so therefore I think it's on a case-by-case basis, and that's what I would be saying to senior management, you know, to leave it to the contract and have that in the contract arrangements rather than at our level, and only us when it's a financial risk to the council per se.
I I mean, we're getting the report on the waste management because we're specifically tasked by council to look after that financial implication of that contract. We have no other contract where we are so tasked. And I don't clear what's coming. So
I wonder whether with the refresh, I think where you're coming from is how our third party risks. What's our process? What do we do? So I think recommendation 2 should be that as part of the refresh, third party risk, the procedure for third party risk is included. Okay. And then in relation to 3, I think that relates to our strategic partnerships work, which, as you know, is on our radar, has been for a very while, and that we consider as part of that process how risk registers are also captured. So we're looking at process, not the detail. Yeah, does that help? And then you get your assurance from those frameworks.
Conscious that although getting into the minutiae of risks is so very much more interesting than looking at the frameworks. It is really the frameworks that we're responsible to ensure are in place. If the frameworks are in place, then the risks should come forward and they can then be managed by our staff or staff of these organisations. That's what we're trying to help. John, you were making some lightning changes there.
I was. I wonder, Claire, would you mind just trying to articulate the further?
I'll do something on email to you.
Okay, thank you.
So we'll get that done. Sorry, we'll get that done and we'll come back then to the recommendations. Do I edit or comments?
Yeah.
So Councillor Watts.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I just wanted to congratulate Paul Smith and his team on ACO1, and even though in the Hereford Times it came across as a little bit less, I think that they did a fantastic job, and that really is to be recognised within how it was achieved. Okay, my other points, Paul, in the 60 people that you mentioned, the leadership group, what layers of management are involved in that? Directors, heads of service, ADs, what were the range of those in that leadership group training?
We had a representative, I think, from a couple at director level, a couple at AD level, service managers, and then a couple of other kind of key managers within different functions. So it probably spans about 4 tiers there.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that's really exciting, because I know that 2 years ago we didn't have that picture, when I first started, so on AMG. Okay, my other points are regarding specific, and it is picking up on previous points. On page 48, it is around the EU exit and just raising about the inflation. It's kind of like just making it public that we do pick up on these things around, as Councillor Ginman was saying earlier under CS13, is that if there is uncertainty, inflation, resource restrictions, and there's always that fluidity. Under page 53, something that I wanted to pick up under EP15 was about transport infrastructure. Is that ours, or is that the external partners? Because I'm conscious at the moment of Yeoman's stopping a service that is having an impact, and we're putting on free buses as part of the Busset, free buses over the county over the weekend. So there's kind of like a bit of a disconnect at the moment, and that's again another situation where a third party who we depend upon to put on buses has taken off a service, but is looking at our reputational risk indirectly. So could we have, I don't know how to.
Certainly not knowing the details of exactly what the officers kind of committed to paper there from their head and meaning exactly on their certainly something we can take it away and query that, but it could be the example we talked about before where we've, pushed it out and tried to transfer that risk, but we continue to kind of hold the risk effectively. It's something I can go away and perhaps do a little bit more digging and report back to committee on.
Yeah, that would be really useful for me, Paul, because I think again we've been on the back foot. We're having to put out positive comms to actually say it's not us.
Yeah.
It's not a council issue. It's actually, a third. It's a particular company that has made those decisions because they're unable to get drivers. So that'd be fantastic. So thanks for that. Continuing on page 53, EP 23, it's about ash dieback. And I know that we've raised this, but I'm very conscious is that I haven't seen as yet a tree strategy come onto the table within the council, even though it was a full motion some time ago. And I'm just wondering about how we square that circle. It's really just picking up. And also, I know in previous A&G committee meetings, Councillor Jimman has raised about the other diseases that are taking place within, with our woodlands. And as we know, there are rather big projects going on about tree planting, coming from DEFRA, etc. So it would be really great to have some feedback about how this links into the council's tree strategy. Page 53. Oh yeah. Sorry about this. I'm going backwards and forwards. Page 54. It's EP 24, which is the local flood risk management strategy. And something for me, and I know that the flood management plan is to be renewed soon. I think it's this year or next year. But something that I'm very conscious of is that the granular detail in that strategy looks at market towns, but not the impact on rural areas. And I don't know if this is an appropriate forum to raise it, but it's something that I would like more detail on, because I know that that strategy is needing to be, the plan is needing to be revised. But yeah, it's one to bring to attention that I would certainly like a briefing paper on about impact on rural communities. And now that we've got so many other we've got the rotary ditching tool, we've got a lot more council run services to deal with flood risk management, and how is that informing the strategy. And last but not least, EP 27, it's Herefordshire fuel poverty level. I think that this is again, because of the conversations around the gas prices and gas companies again, it's again another one where we are unfortunately victim to external forces. But something that I'm very conscious of is around the fuel poverty levels in the rural communities, because, with rising gas, fossil fuel prices and gas prices, and we know that a lot of the rural housing that we have is, has not got good insulation. So I'm just wondering if it's, again, that's one I'm watching as well, to see about the actual inherent risk that we have.
I think, Paul, if you've passed on those concerns to the relevant risk managers, that would be helpful. Obviously,
I suspect it's meant
it is getting to a granular level, but
yes,
I hate to introduce, but they are no doubt, they're certainly the fuel poverty issue relates to what we were talking about a few minutes ago, and all of them all of these risks are important, but these are particular ones where there's a high degree of volatility at the moment.
I'm grateful you're not going to put me on the spot with them. I suspect there's probably a couple of briefing papers there that we possibly need to just get around to yourselves in terms of, you know, the intention of the tree strategy and the flooding strategy. And the fuel poverty one is one I will pick up as a conversation potentially with management board in terms of the strategic risk, the horizon scanning risk. That feels like a much bigger one rather than just, you know, it sitting within a service in its own right. It feels like it, you know, it's multiple threads from across the council which probably need resolving to play whatever part we can in that.
May well have some effect on our discretionary council tax requests. Requests for payments, they then influence some other issues on the tax base, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Paul and Chair, for taking those points up. And it's really, for me, because what I am really concerned about is often rural parishes get lumped with the nearby city or market towns. And I really do think we need to start to segregate the impact of some of these, like fuel prices, etc., on those communities, because they are the ones that have less access to public services, to GP services and whatever. They've got longer to travel to them. They've got fewer services, bus services, etc., etc. So they are more marginalised than the city, those who live in cities and market towns. So thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Right. First of all, thank you very much for your introduction at the beginning. I really did appreciate you coming up with the number of things that you have been working on over the last 12 months, because I think you have been doing a great deal of work. And I think in our committee, we're always asking for more, or, you know, and I think we need to also reflect you and officers have been on a journey, and that journey is continuing, but you have done quite a lot of work. So I appreciate that summary. Couple of sort of high-level process questions for me. The first one really is we're looking at a July register, and you know we are now looking, you know, we're almost in October. So one thing that, Chair, if you don't mind, when we talk about the work programme at the end of the meeting, something that I might bring up again, because I think we just need to look at the timing of when we're reviewing the risk register. Because, for example, Councillor Bartlett's comment about care homes are probably would have been quite different if we were reviewing it at the time at an early meeting. So that's just in terms of the timing of when we see the risk register. I'd just like to pick that up probably towards the end. Minor process points in terms of your heat map. There are a number of risks marked, and also your comments in paragraph 6 of your report. Some of the risks are marked as closed or have been removed off the corporate risk register. But when I look at Appendix A, those that have been closed are still listed as further mitigation required. So it's just maybe reflecting those comments in the appendix. So if we did that in the appendix independently, we actually have the what is reflected in your covering report. I think that I would find that helpful. Also, CR 39, where we're talking about the reassessment of the COVID-19 risks. I wanted to get a better understanding if this is going to be forming part of your new strategic risk approach, which you're discussing with management board in October, or has it got different timings? Is it? That's just a question.
I'll answer that one, John. So
I was going to go on all of them.
Oh, yeah,
feel free.
I was going to jump in while I
Go on then.
So on the COVID risk register, we are, because we've still got emergency planning in place, we still are having it as a as a separate register. What we'll have to do when we do the strategic risk session next week is consider you know, whether what's going to be really interesting, I think, about that conversation is obviously it's an operational risk, but it is a strategic risk as well. And where will therefore, what will that mean? I don't know the answer to it yet. That will be part of our conversation, but I definitely see it as being a separate risk register, probably while we get through the winter issues, I think. Okay.
And then one of the things that I picked up in your address, which wasn't in your report, is your commissioning of a risk system. And that's one thing that I'm rather interested in, and understand as well how, whether that is linking to the corporate objectives. Because at the end of the day, this risk register is all about us not being able to achieve the risks that are going to stop us from achieving our corporate objectives. So with a system, ideally you would be starting with your corporate objectives and then linking all of your risks to in cascade, in sort of a cascading fashion. So it's the first time I've heard about that initiative, so that's something that I'd like to know a little bit more about.
Okay.
Sorry, Chair.
I suppose the first thing as well, I was a bit remiss of me to miss out in terms of just sort of selling the stuff that we've done as well in the last 12 months. We're just about to kick off a risk maturity assessment as well with SWAP. So sat down, we agreed the paperwork last week, so it's fresh off the press, and it's just about to go out to risk leads in terms of a self-assessment approach. So I think that will provide us a bit more evidence there as to those last few things that we want to strengthen, you know, in this year's thing, or potentially carry forward into future iterations. So risk system. Yes, we've just started. We've looked at it a couple of times actually over the last 12 months. The initial, you know, ask of the system is just to cut down the amount of production time that it takes. You know, we're running off of Excel spreadsheets. We need people to go in, update them, so on and so forth. And that's quite a challenge. But of course, then, yeah, that will allow us to think about how our alignment works better, which talks to some of the other conversations we've had in previous committees about impact on our strategic objectives. And that in itself probably then links back to the timing of the papers conversation. I think we're now on, you know, I think we had our pre-meet effectively, that was 2 weeks ago. Week before that for production of papers, then we're back into August, then, you know, and then we've got a couple of weeks to allow officers to update, which is why we end up with that lag. And, you know, appreciating any conversation we can have about timing and the like. It might give us some opportunities, but in our current paper-based system or electronic paper-based system, we will struggle to make that much more timely. I know some authorities who do use various systems are brave enough to just go on the fly in terms of the conversation in their audit and governance committees or similar. You know, we're probably a bit of time away from that. We commission the system, it's not in overnight, but it certainly allows us to start thinking that way, and we can genuinely start to see then how embedded it is. You know, when were these risks last updated by officers and the like? And say from my point of view, I'm really clear that that will help us drive that ownership back into the key service areas. You know, if you're sat there looking at a key risk to the organisation which hasn't been reviewed in the last 2 months, 3 months, it does sort of start to ask questions then, doesn't it? So yeah, so I think those 2 points really link around the risk system and the risk and the timing of conversations within this committee. And then thinking about the other things you said about when we've stepped them down, is there further mitigating activity? I think it's right that we will still have that further mitigating activity. You know, even if it's at a directorate level, it's stepped down to there will still be further actions. Perhaps just a little bit of a thought for myself to take from that, where we've closed those risks and we've identified that there's further mitigating activity, there's a question mark there, just to make sure that that's all triangulated. So, you know, good practice would suggest that we've not got further stuff to do if we're then closing the risks. So, although I wonder in the examples we've got in front of us, they may be that they are risks which have merged and pulled together to get, you know, bigger risks there. And the last one then on the COVID risk register, I think there are the operational things which sit within that COVID risk register, which will continue to reside in there. I think there are some in there that I could see sitting as part of that strategic risk conversation. I think particularly things like the impact to learners. You know, we've gone through 18 months where, you know, children have been kind of in and out of classes, and the impact of that, I feel that probably starts to reside more in a strategic risk setting rather than just, you know, the operational day-to-day management of that. So I think there will be kind of a combination of some of those may push out into different sources. But yes, we have a started for 10 drafted to lead that conversation through management board, and I certainly know I've got one or two of those COVID risks which have been kind of just teased out to sit there. So.
That's great, thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of the audit and how you this new strategic risk approach. So I watch with interest. Thank you.
Councillor Dimmock.
Just to come back on one particular and then the general. I noticed in EP10, it says this presents a significant political risk as the project is very successful and popular. I'm slightly surprised at the word political appearing in a risk register. And I know it's a small p, but I did wonder as to where one puts such an emphasis. I mean, I totally accept the premise that it's popular and successful, but I wasn't sure that risk registers carried such a sort of connotation. And then the sort of more general question, which I think has been touched upon in a way, is where there's an overarching risk. So, for example, we've now got figures from the Bank of England suggesting interest rates might go up. Is there a sort of sensitivity on these risks where we can say that change will have an effect on particular aspects? Can we sort of, is there a way in which you capture that so that we don't get surprised by change? Equally, there's significant concern about inflation. Say building materials is a good example recently. Now that's been massive change in price. There must be a risk in there ongoing to certain aspects, which was beyond anything anybody had thought about, I think would be fair to say. I just wonder if in capturing the generality of a risk, do we have a sort of sense of the sensitivity? I suppose it's almost a sensitivity analysis I'm looking for, saying, will that risk, what is it subject to particularly? And are we capturing the sensitivity of that? And the third one on there was manpower and staffing. I mean, you can't get planners for love of the money. You can't get social workers for love of the money, almost, it seems. You certainly can't get drivers of certain vehicles at the moment. There must be a sensitivity within various of these departments to those. And I think that follows on a little bit the point that I think you were raising earlier, that if we're providing social service visits to people who are in distress, who have difficulty, who need regular attendance, many of those may be private companies now. They're not actually undertaken by the council service. But I would become very concerned that they are struggling to find people to work for them. They're now going to be struggling to find fuel to put in their vehicle. I heard of somebody only last night abandoned their car in Ross and Wye, had to get somebody else who'd got some fuel in order to get back home. So, I mean, this is happening on a local level. And when you think of the rounds that some of these people who are doing home help are doing, they're massive in terms of mileage and requirements. So I'm just concerned at how we capture the overarching risk and the sensitivity to some of the risks that are written in here. COVID is not over, as we can see. I mean, we're now a hotspot almost for it. We've got one school closed, etc. If you get a change in the nature of COVID, what happens to personnel then? You know, I suppose it's the sort of thing that as a company you look at very carefully, knowing what would happen to us if our business had X, Y, and Z. And each of the departments has looked here. But have we got that global feeling of the council would struggle to provide?
I suppose a couple of points to pick up in there. That conversation about interest, inflation, financial instability. For me, I've got that on the page and on the working draft landed or ready to land next week in management board as our strategic risk register. I think there's definitely something there. I think there's a really good question actually in terms of if we're sitting there and we're talking about commissioning a risk system. We've got a demo in a couple of weeks' time with a different provider. Can we, within that system, identify all the risks which would have an element if interest rates were to skyrocket significantly, or inflation continues to increase, or the cost of materials? Can we identify those elements within the risks which are articulated within services? So we could say, well, actually, if we do see interest or inflation rates increase, can we click a button somewhere to go, and that has a knock-on effect here, 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 and here? That would be an ideal world scenario. It could be that, you know, the onus will still be with service areas to consider how that will impact on their individual business areas. But I think, you know, one of the other positives of if we commit to a system is we will have more time to sit and challenge people and make people think about their risks that they hold in their individual services. So rather than running around pushing, you know, a risk between various different versions of Excel spreadsheets, we will be able to sit back and do more of that challenge. You know, we do some at the moment. I'd like us to do more. And of course, an additional risk manager or risk and assurance manager, that's additional capacity there. So I think that will help us bring about those things. But definitely, interest and inflation is probably one of those horizon scanning strategic risks that will be on the table for management board. And I think I've also got drafted in there is something about workforce skills and recruitment, both for us as an employer, as Herefordshire Council, but also for key partners. You know, I think on and off over a period of time, we've had domiciliary care workforce in adult social care jump up and jump back down based on kind of current trends. And we may start to see that increase again now in the coming months. I noticed that we do have operational risks in adults around staffing and recruitment, and specifically staffing and recruitment for OT as well. We also do have a recruitment strategy sat with our AD of people. Reality is that's probably a static risk which sits, you know, in an operational risk register. It needs to be taken out and owned by management board, and potentially even further than that, that strategic risk register doesn't just live with management board, sits across management board and cabinet as well, because that will be a key driver on whether we can achieve, you know, our strategic objectives as per county plan and the like. So I think that will be a real key point, that strategic risk register, which will land a lot of things on a page, and it will make us, you know, consider them when we're thinking about our delivery plans and the like. And it will tie the various elements together a little bit better.
Thank you.
Andrew.
Thank you, Chair. And just come in on the interest rate issue and price inflation. The council has its treasury management strategy that gets reviewed every year by council. We've recently just run a all-member training session with our retained consultants to talk us through the issues. For the council, the majority of our borrowings are fixed terms, so any change in interest rates doesn't impact on the cost of current borrowing. Clearly, it will have an impact on future borrowings. And the other side is because we invest our spare cash, interest rate rises, I mean, we will get a good return on that. So we do look at it very closely. It does come into full council once a year through the budget setting process. And then medium-term financial strategy also picks up some of the issues around price inflation, cost of employing people, and the nature, so that it does get aired those routes as well as the risk register.
Thank you. Yeah. I think Councillor Gentleman's comments sort of, they made me think much more broadly about the kinds of issues in parishes. I appreciate it's interesting that as a body, part of our public health statutory duties are to do with pharmacy provision, for instance. But we're not required to do a similar review of banking provision or post office provision or rural petrol station provision. But those provisions equally impact on the viability, the quality of life of those people who live in the county. And issues with interest rates increasing can easily impact them on the viability of rural businesses. Accepting that we do try and help them through the rural business rate structure sequence, specifically jobs and those others, some of the counties. But yeah, it does make you reflect on the where the council's responsibilities end and where they should end. Who's going to pay for all of that, I suppose. But I think when we look at our responsibilities to adult social care, for instance, provision of banking facilities, provision of post office does impact on how we can address those, and whether or not we should have some sort of contingency contract for fuel. Major suppliers in the county who even over my 30 years in the county, we've seen rural petrol stations shut, so that there isn't a lot of slack in the system in terms of supplying fuel. Whether we should not be addressing some of those issues so that we can look after the delivery of services to adults and vulnerable. That might be something that I suppose the chief executive might like to take up with his managing board and creatively think as to how we might encompass those or mitigate against those risks. Councillor Watson.
Sorry, I'm also going to point out something that I would like to see within Economy in Place. It's around the housing strategy, because it's around, we were just talking about it around the core strategy and the review of the core strategy. But with the moratorium in the north, the pressures have been put on the south. There are many more housing developments being pushed into rural areas, and for me, it's a real concern, because I think that with looking at the global markets and our changing world, is that our policy is also running behind the scene as well. And I'm really sorry to raise the point, but I am really concerned about housing developments in rural areas, because it's creating car-dependent estates in rural parishes, and we can't do anything about it. Even the planning inspectorate turns over the fuel decisions, and it's a really tough one. But I'm sorry to raise it, but I don't know if it's appropriate, but it's something I would like to see in a future risk register around housing. Is it appropriate, Chair?
I suspect it's appropriate depending on how it's phrased. But perhaps if we could ask Paul to take that away and discuss with Barry and see how it might fit into their risk register and be accounted for. Would that be acceptable?
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
If we can come back to the recommendations. Those you good memories we discussed a while ago. John, put that up on the screen.
I'm not sure, Chair, that 2 and 3 are quite right yet, but they are recommendations I think I've heard. The first recommendation, in addition to that set out in the report, is that significant partnership framework considers how risks held by partners are assessed and affect the council. A second risk that a recommendation that I think I've heard, but correct me if I've got this wrong, is that the committee would like a briefing paper on how risks such as EP24 flood risk and EP27 fuel poverty is being managed in rural areas. And this is the one I'm less confident on, but global factors Global factor risks such as interest rates, workforce shortages are reviewed in relation to their sensitivity to more vulnerable members of rural communities.
With respect, the last one, I think I was seeking sensitivity with regard generally. So it was a question of what is their sensitivity to changes and does the risk register reflect that? So global factor risks such as interest are reviewed in relation their sensitivity to change, full stop. And sudden change, I suppose, was the particular point that we were really picking up, wasn't it?
Sudden change is an issue which risk registers always have difficulty.
Absolutely, and I think that's, I mean, it is motherhood and apple pie question, I accept that in a way, but on the other hand, it is the very thing that's catching people out at the moment, is the suddenness of the changes and the scale of them.
Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Watson.
Yeah, sorry, Chair. It's also just bringing up at that point, and it's not just one factor, it's several factors at the same time. That's and it's that flexibility and that reactivity that I think that, as you're saying, is that with a corporate risk register looks to us as static, but it's continually moving. And I think that we have a snapshot when it comes onto our table. And I think that it's about the assurance with that I feel has been given by Paul by saying that it's coming, the corporate risk, the risk register is coming across the table of the senior management on a much more frequent basis. And so therefore that does provide me with some reassurance, at least it's being monitored into, just like the care home situation, is that it's been managed as and when.
Thank you. Are we, Claire?
Sorry, I think there was another risk about third party risks being considered as part of the refresh of the risk management plan. I think it was number 1 to begin with.
We split them out, didn't we?
Very clear. Could you just say that again?
It was that third party risks would be considered in the annual review of the risk management plan. I'm sure it's better worded the first time, but we know what it means.
Councillor Watson.
Sorry, Claire, before you read them out, I always get confused in what should be a recommendation and what should be an action plan on our action planner. So, just for example, the briefing paper, should that actually be seen on our action planner as opposed to recommendations? I just like to question as you go through if there should be recommendations.
Is the view of the committee that actually the briefing papers are more an action than they are a recommendation?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I think that's
Yeah.
Okay, so recommendation one is that significant partnership framework considers how risks held by partners are assessed and affect the council. But third-party risks will be considered in the annual management plan. The action, as defined earlier, will be listed in action now rather than a recommendation. And then the third recommendation is that global factor risks such as interest rates, workforce shortages are reviewed in relation to their sensitivity to sudden change.
Thank you. Still the essence of our discussions over the last narrative. Can I ask for those recommendations? I'll table those recommendations now, so okay, support them. It's passed unanimously. Thank you. Would committee like a short comfort break? Or do you want to press on? Press on. Okay, press on now. Agenda item 9. The annual government statement draft for 2020-21. It's coming back to us after the last meeting. The Youth Committee has written the draft annual government statement, which is draft for 2020-21, properly reflects the risk environment the council is operating in and the appropriateness of any actions required to improve it. The draft will be published with the draft statement in the accounts. I don't know, Andrew, we did speak about this at the last meeting. If there's any comments you want to make on the changes that have been made so far, or whether we just go and any further comments that we have on the
So I'm happy if we go straight into the review comments.
So committee, do I have Councillor Watson?
It's the eye. Yeah, are you going to raise Councillor Bartlett's?
Well, I will do, yes.
Yes,
Thank you for reminding me that.
Yeah, thanks. My point is, you probably know, is around the local family justice board. On the 30th of July, I was asking if it, because it hadn't been completed, that's on page 99, and it was really just to find out, because I see that the significant partnerships were actually completed around April, May this year, on all the others. And now with it being October and having raised it in July, it doesn't seem to have been done. So could I ask that it is completed? No.
I would suggest that is a recommendation.
Thank you. Yeah. So if we could have the local family justice board significant partnership self-assessment completed, please. And my other point is that I suppose this is a question for Claire, but what is the next step of the significant partnership self-assessments? You know, what's the view of what happens next?
This forms part of the audit work, which I think is over a year out of date now, I'm afraid, to report the whole refresh of strategic partnerships. So what the appendix 3, I think it is, in the annual governance statement is just a snapshot of it, of at that point in time, what is the partnership looking like? What needs to happen really is that overview of the whole process to ensure we've got partnerships that fit the purpose. We have a process that properly identifies it, because you get them once a year isn't enough. So what you probably need from me is a paper on what those next steps are and what that strategic partnership work is going to look like.
Okay. Just to come back on
Is
this.
that form a recommendation or an action?
Is that already part of our recommendation? That's what I'm going to use that. Part B is the committee considers the register of significant partnerships and asks the section 151 of the commission of spot audit on the outstanding self-assessment. So I'm not quite sure if that's already covering Councillor Watson's point on the
Family Justice Board, yeah.
but also on the earlier agenda item, where we were talking about where there's no's to some of these things. So I wasn't quite sure what B actually meant, so.
B is because when one isn't completed, we go to swap. So that's part of our process, so that it isn't just officers asking officers, actually we escalate it, and that's what you're asking for.
Okay.
So you're asking for it to be completed, so our
Yes.
process is that goes to swap to do so.
So B is already addressing Councillor Watson's point, but we've got some other elements that perhaps need to be in a further recommendation that will address a more detailed analysis of what actually is in the table.
Yeah, I think in relation to the strategic partnerships work, as you know, it's been on hold. I think probably you just have an action from me that you get what I'm going to do about it, what's the plan, what's the timeframes. I don't think you'd want a paper into committee. You want the paper into committee when that work's been completed.
Councillor Newman.
Yes, thank you very much. Clearly, this picks up on my earlier points about the number of no's and looking at these things. And I suppose I was uncomfortable if we were suggesting that we were content with this statement when there are areas in it which clearly further work needs to be done, and it needed the recommendation somewhere needed to reflect that those areas which I've just highlighted another one that I've just picked up. I mean, there's quite a few in here where we've got these various bodies, Heritage and Local Nature Partnership, and that there in terms of references updated, no. Is there a membership agreement in place? No. Is the document in the authority partnership and the roles and responsibility of members clear and documented? No. So these all carry risks, which I'm not sure how we get this into approving the statement at the same time and saying it has holes in it which we need to have filled.
So you either have to make a recommendation within the annual governance statement for a new action, which is a review of those statements, or it remains as it is as a review of the strategic partnerships generally.
If we go to page 83 of our this section that covers our actions in the annual governance statement, and I think number 17 does address partnership framework, which indicates that it is in progress. Whether we just maybe need to augment that with some of our comments from today, and that may then enable us to approve the draft.
Yeah, with respect, I'm perfectly happy that as long as we reflect the fact that these are actively being filled, then that statement stays true. Perhaps timelines on active would be nice, because should we be saying by the next statement might be a sensible way of approaching it. We look for those areas which are currently under review being completed.
And if I can assist with Appendix 2, going into sign off of accounts, in 6 months' time, a lot of these will come off because they've been completed, and then the new ones, the ones that are carried forward will be there, and then all the ones out of this statement come onto it as well. Because obviously there are some actions within the statement that are identified as well.
In terms of next year's draft, is it intended to do this on an annual basis, or is this I've never been told, so excuse my memory, if that's the case, or is it to be done on a regular triennial basis or some other mechanism?
So it's signed off annually. You see it once it's a draft and you see the action list, I think twice a year.
Sorry, I was being specific in relation to the partnership framework.
Partnership framework would come as a separate item to you when it's ready, because it's linked to the audit report and was linked, as you know, before that, I think probably 3 annual governance statements ago, which identified it as an issue.
So am I expecting to see in future annual government statements a section on partnership framework as an ongoing
Yes,
section?
yes.
Right. But are the annual reviews of those partnership frameworks then going to be instigated on an ongoing basis?
Yes,
So
of course.
we'll always effectively be receiving draft reports which say this way, we're still waiting for one body or other to complete that. It's going to be an ongoing angst, as it were, because not every partnership body will receive the form and put it in and send it back in a week, as would be beneficial, but for various reasons.
Potentially, but because we're going to refresh what is a strategic partnership, remember there's all that still to do, that will help, I think, because the list should reduce. And therefore, that's when you know whether they're real risks or not, because are they really a strategic partnership or are they just a meeting of interested people?
Come back on that. I mean, first of all, Mayor said, I think the way in which these are set out is very helpful, because it's got all of the items that make up that particular partnership, the aims, the purpose, everything in that. It seems to me that is something we should say, we're
that matters a lot of work.
exactly. And I think that's very nice, because it does put it very boldly in front of us. Perhaps, therefore, when entering into significant partnerships in the future, such a format should be able to be filled within, one could argue, either before the partnership is completed and signed or within 6 months of it doing. In other words, perhaps there should be a timeline that says that such as this should be able to be completed with an explanation of why one bit of it is not, as a guide to then what risk might be carried by it. Now, I don't know that's a recommendation or action, but it seems to me this is a great way of capturing what something's about, what it's trying to do, who's in control of it, who owns it, and therefore what the risks are. Therefore, in a way, following those formats and having them completed, shall we say, within 6 months of any partnership programme being agreed.
I know Councillor eager to come in. I think the comments from Councillor Harper are quite suitable to use up at this time, so I'm just going to read what she's written. I think with self-assessments and recommendations still need some work to do. Can we ask that the self-assessments are looked at more closely, somebody describe themselves as different to a significant partnership? I think it would be time that that will be done. Some have not answered whether there is any council liability. Also, some do not appear to report to anyone despite the council financing. That's recommendation 2 just calls for an audit of the outstanding self-assessment. Can this be widened to include an analysis of the risk, transparency, and governorship of these partnerships? So I think that's one for the criteria for swap. Definition of what a swap might be. As to whether there was any.
We've already had a swap audit on that point. That's the work I've now got to implement.
Fine. Thank you. Right. So we'll have that swap report coming to us possibly in.
You had it some time ago, I'm afraid. I think it's over a year ago. I can recirculate it.
I think because it's sort of the interest in it perhaps wasn't so apparent at the time, but it's now apparent to recirculate it.
I'll recirculate it, yeah.
To be able to Page 62, paragraph 9C states we can request fuller details from the self-assessment. rights. Would a deeper analysis fit this criteria? I'm not quite sure what she means by that. Which may be within that SWAN document. So I think we'll circulate that document and then see whether there's any further action to take. So I'm just addressing those points. Councillor Watson, personally, Councillor Watson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. For me, when it was going back to on page 83 about partnership framework, point 17, to review the effectiveness of current arrangements with the framework covering significant partnerships and steering groups. When we're looking at effectiveness, what are we actually looking at? Because is it about the vision and the aims and the objectives, or is it the partnership agreement? And that's something that I really wanted to understand. It's about how do you measure the effectiveness? Do you measure it within the partnership, or from the point of view, from the council's perspective, that it is achieving the desired outcomes of the objectives? So that's really, sorry about.
So that effectiveness is about the arrangements that we have for strategic partnerships. So if you remember, I was saying back in the annual government statement, it's got to be 2 years ago, is it fit for purpose? I was saying it wasn't. So the work is to look at what is why do we need a process? Does the process work? Is it effective? So we've got kind of halfway there. We know it doesn't particularly work, because you've seen from some of those answers that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So therefore, what do we need to put in place? What risks are we trying to cover off? What awareness do we need of these partnerships to then know it's effective? Okay.
Yeah, no, thanks. And but I really just want to say thank you very much for this piece of work, because I know that in my roles, it's really helped me to see, all the different relationships and interconnectedness across many. And I think that it's a really good piece of work. So thank you for that. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. My question sort of is coming on from that point is, we're looking at effectiveness, but then who is performing that review? And I know that the work on regional governance, we're looking at scrutiny and which committee the scrutiny should have oversight over certain strategic partners. So whether within this table, each strategic partner, they're essentially allocated a scrutiny committee, and then that can then build into their work programme, that they know that these are the significant partners that fall underneath their umbrella to build into their review universe, and to determine whether they need to get reports from them. So that would be very helpful.
Any further comments? If not,
Sorry, I have some specific comments throughout the annual the statement of nobody else has anything. First of all, thank you. I think a number of the comments that I have made previously have been picked up in this version, so that was fabulous to see. Just some specific questions. Page 7 or 73. Principle C, define outcomes in terms of sustainable economic, social and environmental benefits. I think there's probably a number of comments where I think we've talked about some things under some principles, whether there's overlap with other principles. And I don't know, we could be here all day debating on whether it should be listed under various principles, but I guess a question I had around this was the continuous improvements that we're making around risk management and also value for money. I know we do mention it at other points in the document, but whether principle C, where we're talking about sustainable economic, social and environmental benefits, there needs to be some reference to it there, and the amount of work that we have done and what we're doing in the future. And that was the first point. Then I know we've talked about this number of site and improvement sessions and a couple of sections throughout the document. So we've talked about it on page 8 or page 74, and we've also talked about it on page 10, which is also page 76. But they're called two different things in both locations. So, and also I question why there's no audit and governance representative at those sessions as well, because you have scrutiny involved in them, but nobody from audit and governance from this perspective. So it's a line that's, I think, on page 8, it's referred to as member oversight and improvement sessions, but on page 10, it's referred to as improvement and development sessions. So it's almost the same, but slightly different. I'm assuming they're the same thing.
Yeah.
And whether AMG
These are the old performance challenge sessions that are now called, that's the official term, we've got two different versions of it.
They are oversight and improvement sessions.
Okay.
So if we can
I'll pick that up with you afterwards, Claire.
ensure uniformity, and also whether going forward there can be a audit and governance representative if scrutiny be invited, which doesn't impact the MTS, but the other point I had was in the director's statement for children and families, it does go into some detail, a little bit more detail in terms of the work that had been going on, but not necessarily reflected quite so much in the body of the document. So I didn't know whether the improvements somehow needed to also be reflected in a continuous improvement section, because you unless I've overlooked something.
No, there's a, if you think about the improvement plan and the pillar for governance and leadership, that probably does need to be cross-referenced, yeah.
Also on page 8 or page 75, under continuous improvements, I think last year we had continuous improvement to deliver opportunities from the adult social care peer challenge.
That's on the action plan number
That's
6.
on the action
Yeah,
plan. Sorry, that's
Yeah.
something I've overlooked.
that's fine.
That's fine. Page 1076. So this is in relation to Principle F, managing risk and performance through robust internal control and strong public financial management. One of the controls that were put in, and this is probably not necessary for the document, but more for my personal information. Employees with budget responsibilities needed to complete an online awareness module regarding finance and register that it was completed. We've got it as a control, so I'm just interested to understand whether we have achieved a percentage of completeness that control is from control. I don't know. I don't expect an answer now, but
The 1, 2, 3. I think it's the 4th bullet point.
if we've had a low uptake, then I don't necessarily see that it's something that fits within our government statement. But if we've had a strong uptake, then I could see that it could be a control.
You can find the data for you.
Yeah, I'll have a look.
I don't think it needs to go into it, but it's just if we're going to make a statement. Yeah. Also under the continuous improvement section, and I apologise if I overlooked it again, where partnership governance arrangements reviewed between the council and higher education.
Yep, that's in the action plan. Where's that one? Because that hasn't quite finished. Bear with me, we'll find the number for it. Yeah, number 23. that will continue. Oh, great, thank you very much. Page 11, this is not complete. The last bullet point of section G, where's the number of excluded meetings? That's just an asterisk, isn't it? Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't record those. So I filled that in on the hope that we did, but we don't. But we need to record them. That's the sort of thing we get FOI on, and actually it's quite a good indicator of, you know, transparency and openness. So I've asked that they're recorded, and we had our first one last week. I know we went to private session, so that will be recorded going forward. Okay, I can put that into a continuous improvement if you want to change it. Something we've identified. So.
Yeah, I think that would be great. Thank you. Yeah, and I think I apologise.
That's pretty useful. Any more comments at all? Councillor Jenner?
Just a question. Various of these sections are signed off by people, obviously, who were in place at the time, but not now. Do they therefore need, as some of them have comments for the future as well as the past, should they also be signed off by whoever is the responsible person holding that position now?
So what will happen is this will be I'll get so confused on the years, because it'll be July next year, won't it? So usually what happens is it's Andrew and I who sign it off at the end,
Right.
but the ones that are there at the moment stay there because they're on a point in time. That's why you don't get hours until the end. That's the kind of fail safe on that, I think.
We know where the buck stops.
So do we have two recommendations? Recommendation made to the draft annual government statement and say corporate threats to this environment against operating in and actions identified appropriate response to this whole raft of actions document. Will we adding to those actions?
I picked up the one risk that Councillor Watson identified, that the local family justice partnership for self-assessment is completed. There was I think a recommendation from Councillor Jim, which I didn't articulate in a way that I could reasonably present it on screen. So I was wondering if you might be able to.
I was suggesting, I think I will put this in words, but I was suggesting that where there are recommendations, where there are statements that are incomplete, the review, there were two things. One, that those are going to be reviewed and therefore filled in the future. And the future was if there were any new partnerships formed, a new the format was used, and there should be a timeline fixed to when that format could be fully filled in. And I think I made the suggestion of 6 months, or otherwise by reason for it not being so done. So those are two slightly different areas. So I think they had the reassurance that the review is going to be ongoing anyway, all the partnerships. On the basis of that, perhaps my first recommendation is now really a case of an action point, which is being followed through anyway. And the second is that from that, the recommendation was that the format that has been used for presentation should apply to any future arrangements, partnerships, etc., and that they should be completely filled in within 6 months, or explanation given.
John, the recommendation you picked up on from Councillor Watson was actually reflected in the recommendation B.
Okay,
That's more actually
that can come out.
asks the section of national stock audit on its outstanding self-assessment, which is the self-assessment of the
So the format being used for the current arrangements should be continued and filled in with or completed within a 6-month timeframe for you.
And apply to all new partnerships or similar arrangements.
Yes, that's what there's on screen, so that everyone can see what we're talking about. Sorry, next one.
Can I just ask, whilst that's coming up, so we've identified that the tables need to be completed, but in terms of the governance arrangements as to who should be reviewing them once they're completed, is that going to be picked up in the further report that you sent to us? So in terms of whether which scrutiny committee, etc., we don't need to include that as a recommendation, but that will come out through the action plan.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, sorry, just to be absolute, not the action plan. That will form part of the strategic partnerships work that might have an action plan, but it's not won't be in this action plan, I don't think, unless you want it to be in the final action plan.
But as long as you pick that up in the work that will then come
Yes.
and be reported back.
Yes.
So this recommendation on screen, in a way, should be recommendation C. So we've got recommendation A, the committee to then determine from the end of the statement. Governance statement appendix 1 properly reflects the risk of environment council's operating actions identified in the committee response, which I think table. B, the committee considers the register of significant partnerships and asset model will under the commission swap audit on the outstanding self-assessment. Table recommendation C for the use of current arrangements to be filled in the 6-month time frame and apply to all new significant partnerships. All happy with those 3 recommendations? All happy, say aye. Thank you. Agenda item 10, committee work programme. Committee will be aware that originally this meeting was anticipating governance document coming to us, but unfortunately it was not enough to extend it forward to us. So that is being put on to a future meeting, and I believe that meeting may either be in this drawing meeting or it will be in the October meeting. Claire, could you just confirm the timing for that?
On reading governance, we have a next working group meeting is 5th of October when we'll be in a better position. I doubt it will be 27th of October. I think that will be quite tight, and I admit I'm not here for that meeting. But I would think it would be early November for December council.
Thank you for that. Councillor Bowen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This may be completely out of order, and I know I'm only a sort of temporary member, but the sources of our funding interest me. I hope it interests us all, really. I was told by Mr. Wiggins that despite us losing 60 million down to 600,000 pounds, we have actually been recompensed in other ways, with other grants and other subventions of one sort or another. Do we have any record of what these are and how we get our money? And what sort of quantity? Are we in fact being made up to 60 million instead by other means or not? I'm completely in should we say, in the dark on this. And probably my own ignorance as to what is here, but I'm prepared to be made enlightened.
It's an interesting question. I'm not, you'd be right, I'm not sure whether it's really going to work for everyone in the Audit Governance Committee. However, I'm sure that the 151 officer would be delighted to write a brief on the funding for the council in terms of revenue and capital over the preceding few years. It is a complex, as all simple questions are.
Sorry.
There comes with a very complex answer because there has been funding, but there has also been a change in the council's duties. Specifically look at COVID related traditional duties. Whether you take COVID funding into account and additional expenditure. Perhaps not, but the central government historically has always come forward with different funding options, some of which the council has to compete for with other councils. Funding source is different from the old grants that used to be given. It's something that that would be interesting to all councillors, I'm sure. Should the officer wish to take up the challenge of addressing so that's
Great.
perhaps, Chairman, to address that question at the next full council meeting.
Oh, we'll see how we can work it in, I think, yes. Ask Mr. Coleman if he can, in some form of words that can accomplish that. But I think it is actually quite important and relevant.
I think your well, it is always sources and scale of funding is always important. Constant challenge for all local authorities, I'm sure. The other item on the work programme was the addressing of a skills matrix. Myself, Vice Chair, then with officers, and like to that the next probably so that we can address these questions before the end of the council year. I think we worked on. Councillor Balderson. I take my hat off to her. She's worked very hard on a basis on which we can look at skills matrix and whether or not using that then to evidence whether an independent member sitting on this committee would add value. I think once we've looked at that, considered it, it will consist of some self-assessment. Self-assessment by its nature means that we naturally ask the question, well, who will see what I'm writing? And I've suggested that although the blank self-assessment forms part of public record, what we assess on ourselves remains within the committee. So no, let's say discuss, but advise sufficient transparency, but sufficient sensitivity to us answering those sort of questions. I'm not sure if there's anything else on the work programme. That's a policy, but
I'd just like to ask if the clerk and Paul can maybe just make sure that the dates that we've got the risk register going forward are the optimum dates for us to review it.
and I'd also following the comments made on corporate, I think I don't know whether it's committed to you, but I'd like to invite the Chief Executive next time we review the corporate risk register to attend to give his comment on investigating corporate risks, mitigation, and his feelings about the risk that the council's carrying. Councillor Jimman and Councillor Watson.
Can we just
Can
come
I just
back,
say,
can we just come back to the you raised the question of whether or not we needed a session solely constitution. I suppose the question, so rather throw it back to because the people here are involved in it. To what extent are you expecting us to review? Is it to the level of the cross of the T and the dot of the I? In other words, are we being expected to review at that level, as I think is our responsibility? And if so, I'm kind of support the view that we're going to do the meeting solely related to that, because I think if that is the level of review, with this current experience of doing these things, all I can say is it takes very often more than one meeting, even then, to go through it. So I'm rather in favour of it being a specific meeting.
Yes, very happy for it to be a specific meeting. It will be a track change document and there'll be a clean document as well. The role of this committee in relation to that document is to say, yes, we're happy. So really it is, although you get another chance as a ward council to vote on it, this is really, are you happy with the work that has been done? Do you think there are any gaps or anything we've missed? So it is quite forensic in that sense.
Mm.
To that end, sorry, just to come on, I find one of the ways of doing this, projecting it onto the wall and then doing it line by line with everybody around, is sometimes quicker than everybody trying to look at. And I think having that facility on the day that can see it, type in the change or can see it and agree it, is sometimes an easier way of achieving, of getting through it. It's just
And I think in our pre-meet, what we could do is look at that, because I wouldn't expect that to be required for every page. There'll be certain pages, I think, which will be of interest to all members, and they're the ones that you may wish to use that facility for.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments. Councillor Watson.
Yes, I just wanted to grab Councillor Bowen just before he leaves. Is that with regard to funding, there's a really good paper coming out from the Rural Services Network, and they're revitalising rural project. But I'm expecting some slides because I went to one of their seminars, which was about systematic neglect of rural counties. And I'll pass it on to you.
very much appreciate
Yeah, and I will actually circulate them to all members.
Well, that'd be good, I think, yeah.
Because, yeah, thank you.
I'm sorry, I didn't go from doing civic duty.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Councillor, for
Pleasure. Do we need to vote on anything before I go?
no, I don't believe we do.
Right, thank you.
So in terms of agenda item 10, note the work programme for the Audit Governance Committee, and note the rethink of governance and skills metrics items to be added. And item 9, the date of the next meeting. The next scheduled meeting is Wednesday, 27th of October. Thank you to all contributors for their participation today, especially to thank officers for their work, operational paperwork for today. Can I check before I close the meeting with Democratic Services that the live stream has been switched on and we're no longer broadcasting live or recording?